Hello and welcome to the Credit Compass, your guide to navigating European credit markets. Each week we unpack the key moves in credit, explore the macro trends shaping the landscape, and dive into the strategies that matter most for investors across Europe and the UK. A section of the upcoming planned Big Beautiful Bill in the US could have some ugly consequences as we unpack the impact that Section 899 out of the bill could have on businesses outside of the US in this week's episode. Further, we outline some long-awaited regulatory changes in European securitization, implementing one of the Draghi report's initial recommendations. Lastly, a recent report from the World Economic Forum outlines the challenges to the global economy and its outlook for the year ahead. Let's get into it. We can't seem to get through an episode without talking about trade, but this week's angle is a little bit different. It's not about tariffs or export controls, at least not directly, but instead about a new U.S. legislative proposal with potentially far-reaching implications for international taxation and capital flows. It's being referred to informally as the Big Beautiful Bill, and while most of it is domestically focused, there's one provision, Section 899, that could have significant consequences for non-U.S. businesses and investors. Section 899 is a relatively obscure clause that's kind of flown under the radar, but its implications are anything but minor. This section authorizes the U.S. Treasury to impose retaliatory tax measures against individuals and companies from countries whose tax regimes are deemed discriminatory towards U.S. entities. So who are these discriminatory tax regimes? Well, the primary targets for this are taxes like the digital services taxes, the diverted profits taxes, and the undertaxed profits rule under the OECD Pillar 2, all of which have been implemented or are under consideration by several countries, particularly within Europe. What's key here is how the US defines discriminatory. It's not a matter of WTO panels or international arbitration. It's up to the U.S. Treasury Secretary, who would be required to submit a report to Congress listing the offending countries. And based on current practice, that list would likely include France, Italy, Spain, Austria, Germany, the UK, and some others like Canada, India, Turkey, Japan, and Australia. The retaliation comes in the form of elevated U.S. withholding taxes. Under current rules, non-U.S. investors typically face a 30% withholding tax on U.S.-sourced income, things like interest and dividends. But under Section 899, this rate would increase by 5 percentage points per year as long as the offending tax remains in place. Now, this is now capped at 20 percentage points, which means after 4 years you would reach the cap. That could mean an effective withholding rate of up to 50% on dividends and significant tax exposure on other forms of passive income. And it doesn't stop there. Section 899 explicitly overrides existing tax treaty protections. That's a big deal because it means long-standing bilateral agreements could be circumvented by this single statute. Even public sector actors such as foreign sovereign funds or public pension schemes may lose their current exemptions under this law. The bill does not target countries as whole entities. It allows the U.S. government to selectively impose penalties on individual taxpayers or specific companies based in those countries. That makes the policy highly discretionary and potentially unpredictable, adding to the complexity and the risk for foreign investors. So what are the broader implications of this? First, it introduces a new layer of regulatory uncertainty into cross-border capital flows. For investors and multinational firms, the risk of being caught in a geopolitical tax dispute is more than theoretical. It's quantifiable in terms of declining after-tax yields on U.S. assets. Second, This provision effectively functions as a slow-motion capital control. If a country's tax policy remains unchanged, the cost of investing in the U.S. markets rises by year. For fixed income investors in particular, this poses a challenge. A French pension fund investing in U.S. Treasuries, for example, could find its net returns steadily eroded not by market moves, but by policy retaliation. And third, it shifts the calculus of international capital allocation. While clever structuring and the use of neutral jurisdictions will undoubtedly offer some workarounds, many investors may conclude that it's simply easier and safer to redirect capital to other developed markets with more stable tax frameworks. Ironically, this may create a tailwind for European capital markets, especially as the region works to deepen its own financial ecosystem. If implemented, Section 899 could end up boosting Europe's attractiveness as a destination for long-term investment, provided the EU can capitalize on the opportunity by delivering regulatory clarity and fostering capital formation. In sum, Section 899 is more than a footnote on a U.S. tax bill. It is a shot across the bow of international tax diplomacy and a potential structural shift in how global capital gets deployed. It deserves close attention from credit and capital market participants on both sides of the Atlantic. While U.S. tax retaliation captures headlines, there's a quieter but equally consequential shift happening in Europe, one that may finally breathe life into a long underperforming segment of the continent's capital markets, and one close to my heart given my past experience: securitization. For years, the EU's approach to securitization has been dogged by excessive conservatism. After the global financial crisis, European regulators leaned hard into caution, imposing strict rules around transparency, capital treatment, and investor due diligence. The intent was understandable, but the effect was profound. European securitization volumes have plummeted, and the market never recovered its pre-2008 functionality. The 2017 securitization regulation, introduced as a part of the broader Capital Markets Union project, was meant to reverse this. Instead, it imposed an even more rigid framework, especially around so-called simple, transparent, and standardized, or STS, securitizations, which were meant to be eligible for more favorable treatment. In practice, however, the rules added complexity without delivering meaningful benefits to issuers or investors. Now, for the first time in years, change is coming. The European Commission, backed by momentum from the Draghi report, has signaled a willingness to revisit the foundational assumptions behind the current framework. A review is underway and several reform priorities have emerged. Recalibrating capital requirements under CRR and Solvency II to more accurately reflect the real-world performance of high-quality securitized assets, particularly those backed by residential mortgages or SME loans. Clarifying definitions around what qualifies as a public securitization and adjusting transparency obligations to align more proportionally with the associated risk. Improving alignment with international standards, including those from Basel and IOSCO, to reduce the friction for cross-border investment. These changes may all sound technical, and they are, but the potential outcome is strategic. If Europe can cultivate a robust, functional securitization market, it can unlock lending capacity from bank balance sheets, deepen private credit channels, and better support green and infrastructure investment objectives. More broadly, this reform effort is a litmus test for the EU's willingness to deliver on its savings and investment union vision, and securitization, if done properly, enables the kind of risk-sharing and financial integration that Europe desperately needs, especially in a macro environment where public budgets are strained and monetary policy is constrained. If the upcoming reforms strike the right balance, we may finally see Europe begin to use securitization not just defensively, but as a forward-looking tool for market development. Now, taking a slight turn and covering the global growth picture, The World Economic Forum May 2025 Chief Economist's Outlook was recently published, and it paints a somber landscape. Surging geopolitical tensions, volatile trade policy, and uneven gains in artificial intelligence are reshaping the economic terrain. The key takeaways from this were, for me anyway, global growth is slowing, particularly in the US, where new tariffs are starting to take a toll. Europe may gain modestly from fiscal and monetary easing. China faces deflationary pressures and struggles to reach its 5% growth target. Trade policy really is the top uncertainty, with higher tariffs expected to inflate costs, reduce trade volumes, and discourage foreign investment. At the firm level, executives are delaying capex decisions, re-engineering supply chains, and investing heavily into AI. However, nearly half of economists surveyed expect net job losses from automation in the near term. That said, AI remains a long-term growth engine, potentially boosting global GDP by up to 5 percentage points over the next decade, assuming governments manage disinformation, concentration risk, and cyber threats while investing in skills and infrastructure. Overall, the message is 2025 could entrench stagnation, or it could set the stage for a more resilient and innovative global economy. Nonetheless, my takeaway was that there are tailwinds that are supportive for Europe. So what else have we got happening? Well, let's start with the European Central Bank. There is a rate decision this week where most are expecting a rate cut. However, many will be watching the post-meeting press conference discussion for hints on whether they will pause here and for how long. We think they are very likely to pause here. Inflation has fallen to target, and even though wage inflation remains elevated, there are increasing signs that growth could start to pick up from here. Consumer confidence is turning in Germany, and as we have mentioned, investment flows are migrating into the region, suggesting renewed investor confidence. However, I don't want to give the impression that everything is overly positive. We still have many over-levered governments struggling with difficult budgetary choices. Here in the UK, Rachel Reeves is negotiating her spending review that will be finalized and announced next week on the 11th of June. France's Prime Minister Bayrou continues to struggle to implement reforms ahead of the passage of the country's 2026 budget. And meanwhile, we have had some political change happening across Europe, with the Dutch government collapsing and a possible political pivot in Poland following the presidential election result on the weekend. So where does that leave us this week? European markets continue to grind tighter, and while we hear about positive momentum in trade talks between the EU and the US, and separately with India, however, the deadline imposed by the US administration of the 9th of July is fast approaching. Risks are building, and markets remain in positive territory for the year so far. So the tone overall remains cautiously optimistic for Europe, but as I've said on a number of podcasts recently, vigilance is essential. That's all for this edition of The Credit Compass. If you found this episode helpful, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends and colleagues. If you have a question or a topic you'd like us to cover, get in touch, and we'd love to hear from you. For more in-depth financial research and ratings, please visit us at KBRA.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay resilient. Let the Credit Compass help guide your way.